Welcome to Authors and Innovators 2024. I am so pleased that we're here with Andrew C.M. Cooper. He is an IP lawyer, an innovator, and an author and a thinker. He's an M&A transactional lawyer with Meta, and he's done a lot of thinking about the role and responsibility of executives. And his new book, The Ethical Imperative, Leading with Conscience to Shape the Future of Business, is a terrific, engaging read. Andy, welcome to Authors and Innovators and our section on changing the story, reimagining responsibility as leadership. I'm glad you're here.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So tell us a bit about your background and how you came to write this book.
Sure. I'm an IP lawyer. I'm from South Carolina, rural South Carolina. I had no exposure to IP growing up. Went to college and ran into an amazing woman named Denise Fulmar, a trademark lawyer at Coca-Cola, who started me on the path of looking into intellectual property and business transactions and how I can bridge my experience from a small rural town working in my grandfather's candy shop to a tech company like Meta Platforms. And I'll tell you, along the way, the experiences that I brought from that candy shop in rural South Carolina are so applicable today. So I wrote this book to convince a generation of emerging leaders that business is a great tool and it can be wielded for good and ill. It's to convince young people that it's not all bad and to convince business leaders that it's not all good. There's work for us to do. My hope is, as executives read this book and emerging leaders read this book, they are inspired by the 4 ethical imperatives to reshape their business to, in this post-COVID world, regain and retain high performance.
That's terrific. I want to talk a bit more about you and your background. So you grew up in a trailer in South Carolina. How were you inspired? You talk a bit about this in the book. It's broken into 3 parts, which I really liked. The first story is really about both forgotten towns and forgotten people. So give us a bit of that background so as people are reading your story, they'll understand your perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, the book is in 3 parts. The first part really covers the sociological issues and the need for a corporate response.
Sets the table.
That's right. There's a great Harvard economist. He's also at Stanford. His name's Raj Chetty, and Raj Chetty came up with this statistic that has borne out over the last several decades, and that's children who are born into the bottom 20% of the income distribution have only a 7.5% chance of reaching the top 20% as an adult in the United States. And he, through empirical research, shows that we have a lot of work to do to improve opportunities for economic mobility in the United States. And so my upbringing is really one of those outliers, one of those kids that did come from the bottom 20% of the income distribution. And I felt it was really important to tell our story in the highest echelons of corporate leadership in business. As you know, Meta Platforms, $1 trillion company, UPS, multi-billion-dollar company. Oftentimes within the executive ranks of these organizations, you don't have folks who have come through the income distribution in that way. And so we approach business in a different way. It's a diverse voice that needs to be heard, and hopefully to inspire young folks who also come from that background that you can also be successful in some of the biggest companies in the world. And by the way, influence the way that they do business ethically.
I like the way that you present this as a generational story, Andy. And as someone who teaches lawyers, I appreciate that and you appreciate that the practice of law or the practice of business is changing so substantially and quickly for everyone entering it. You talk about how companies and leaders need to adapt and be more conscientious, and you were very thoughtful in using that word. Talk a bit about that, particularly as to why and how leaders ought to be thinking about being more conscientious.
Yeah. So just to take one half step back, conscientious is a word that comes from Latin.
Right.
The word conscientious comes from the root conscientia, which means knowledge within oneself, to have a moral sense of right or wrong. And it's very similar to the word conscience, and they share the same root. Conscience really is the why, and conscientiousness is the how. And so what I try to do in the book is to suggest that companies should be hiring and retaining and training leaders that have both sides of that root as a characteristic. They understand the why we should do a thing, the kind of that normative question. And then they also understand the how we should do a thing, the positive part of the equation. Only understanding both sides can you have a leader that is capable of making decisions for a company that are durable. That is to say, they can take data in from communities and different points of view and make a decision that is also good for shareholders over the long term. And unfortunately, in business, we seem to have over-indexed on the idea that shareholder value is the most important thing, when looking at a complete picture, both how a corporation impacts a community and how it operates and the why it should do a thing, create greater value in the aggregate. And that's really the direction that the world is going, as we see younger consumers becoming the primary consumers for businesses and their primary focus. You can see it in the data that young people care about things like, where did your materials come from when you created this thing? Are you reclaiming the waste and excess that your organization produces? Are you hiring from the community that you operate within? All of these things factor into the decisions that consumers make.
And you're a storyteller, and I like how you basically lean into authenticity, because the best storytellers are authentic. You use an example. I don't want to give away too much because I want people to read this book, but talk a little bit about Chick-fil-A and Nike coming to their decisions from very different places, but both of them authentic.
This is true. Chick-fil-A and Nike stand on really polar political views in some ways. Some ways they align, in some ways they're different. Nike, a West Coast company, very progressive in its politics. Chick-fil-A, more of a conservative company. But both organizations have done an amazing job at hiring and retaining leaders that reflect the organizational values in an authentic way. So I talk about one of my colleagues who is in-house at Chick-fil-A, and how she was just gushing with the pride at how the organization went so far as to resod the yard of one of their employees, how it invests in South Atlanta, one of the most deserving and most needing or areas of our community, of resources and effort. And at the same time that Chick-fil-A is doing that, it is holding true to its conservative values of family and community and so on. And it has navigated challenges, political challenges that have challenged some of their intrinsic beliefs around family and values. And they are molding themselves, but in a way that is authentic to Chick-fil-A. Nike, on the other side, has also done the same thing with football players. I talk a little bit about the Colin Kaepernick example, about how Nike has done a great job at aligning with individuals and communities that support causes that are progressive. And both organizations, that you love them or hate them, they both do a very authentic job.
And because they're listening to their stories. So the first part of the book, you're setting the table. The second part of the book I found spoke to me about listening to the stories. And you cite a couple that I thought, and again, I don't want to give too much away. I want to talk about Attenborough's lessons about adaptability for you. And then I want to talk about Mr. Buckner from middle school. These are great stories that you weave in saying to an executive, look, here's the challenges we face. Here are the ways that you can look into your own influences to build your story.
Yeah, no, this is true. So the second part of the book shifts to the qualities of a leader, and that we need a conscientious leader. So I create an archetypal executive, and this archetypal executive we call in the book the conscientious executive. And the most important thing for that type of leader to know is themselves, going back to kind of the root of the
Right.
word conscientious. And I talk a little bit about Attenborough and the ability to change. And everyone knows Sir Attenborough does all of the nature shows and so on.
Still doing them.
He's still
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 doing them.
still doing them. They're great. My daughter loves him, but it talks about the importance of adaptability. And as a leader, knowing your ability to change within circumstances, within context, becomes a really important part of success over the long term, especially in a world where technology is changing so rapidly, where we are in what Azim Azar calls an exponential age. So the elasticity of leaders in circumstances to pivot becomes really important. In contrast to that, I also talk about Buckner's law, my one of my old middle school teachers, Mr. Buckner, and how when I was in his class, he would do all these different experiments, and one of which was about catalysts and how a catalyst can change circumstances without creating a violent result. And that's also a quality that we are going to see in leaders today. If you think about all of the layoffs that are going on, the labor questions that we have to wrestle with, and how technology can soon supplant a lot of human work that is done. Leaders who are deftly able to both increase innovation without creating mass problems for society, so they're able to catalyze a gentle reaction, are going to be the types of leaders that succeed in the world. That means finding ways to reskill and upskill and to help employees transition from one steady state to a new steady state, which is what we are seeing actively right now in tech and in other across industries in the world. These two qualities, and they're just two of the qualities that I talk about in the book, but they really go to the core of the type of executive that we need to raise up.
Andy, you then move to part 3 of the book, and you use these stories to advise executives to invest in relationships, the importance of human capital. You talk about this 20% tithe, which I thought was really interesting. Broader thinking beyond just profit. Talk about this a bit, particularly in the context of people who might be listening to us and might want to read this book as they start work, 5 years in, and 15 years in. So give me the advice for somebody just starting, 5 years in, 15 years in, and how they might be thinking about part 3 of the book.
Yeah. So part 3 of the book is where we get into kind of the moves that matter for leaders. If you are at the beginning of a career, I would say part 5 really distills actionable steps for the 4 moral imperatives. So the book is called The Ethical Imperative because there's really one ethical imperative, and that's to lead with people in mind, to put people at the center of everything we do. There are 4 discrete imperatives that come out of that you can kind of develop as an early career individual. And they are: 1, speed. That means the ability to move quickly, to take on, to learn, to adapt to new technology, to incorporate new technology into your practice. So if you are a young lawyer, for example, today, learning how to use AI becomes an imperative for you. It's to inspire. If you're a young leader or young employee, being inspired by the work or to inspire others becomes critical. And I talk about a Harvard Business Review, which has quantified the way the additional productivity that you get out of an employee. It's almost 2.5 times for someone who is inspired versus someone who's merely just showing up for work. There's community investment as an organization, as leaders, and as an individual. Early in your career, you should be giving back to the community because those things mature into tangible benefits to you later on in the career, both as an individual.
Too,
they're good practice, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. As an individual and as an organization. And then the final imperative is openness, and that's building open systems, building organizations that are broadly able to bring in diverse voices from all over and incorporate those voices into the core values of the group. And as an individual, that means you seeking out mentors, seeking out sponsors and others that are able to enhance your career. But then as an organization, it's also ensuring that you're not caught in this group think, right? By just having everyone that's coming from the same perspective. So if you're early in your career, I would say the book should be really looked at from a high level to, what are the 4 critical things that I should be doing, these moral imperatives. Right. If you're closer to 5 and 15, I would kind of lump those 2 together because the 5 moves that matter really don't change as long as you are in corporate America or in an organization. Those 5 moves generally are, it's a term I call Dory, which really boiled down as just coach and be coached, right? Building strong relationships and strategic investments such that they create a foundation for your long-term success. I use an example of inorganic growth, talk about a few mergers and acquisitions like Disney and Pixar, some that went well and some that did not go well. Then the second move that matters is about human capital investment. That's from an organizational perspective, it means stabilizing families, really investing in employees and development and retention. These are the types of meaningful investments in employees that lead to productive, committed, and satisfied teams, right? The third move is a term I call habitat discordance. It really boils down to building systems to detect non-conforming data signals. So oftentimes we take in conforming data signals, things that are confirmatory of our behaviors and processes and systems and beliefs. But then there are also non-conforming data signals that we really need to have. So I talk about using strategies like having a 10th man, both as an individual and as an organization, someone who is going to challenge everything that your plans are, right? I talk a little bit about corporate parallax, which is this idea of having people within the same organization seeing things very differently, right? Having an appreciation for how you sift through this habitat discordance becomes really important for a move that matter in your mid-career and your late career. Then the fourth step is the maximization default, which boils really down to finding efficacy for employee comfort rather than margin. It means helping them to become efficient at their work as a default part of your business. I talk a little bit about how organizations declutter. I used the example of Clorox and how Clorox really had a major turnaround by taking away a lot of the SKUs that were involved in their retail business and really focusing on the things that mattered the most to the organization. So decluttering at both as an individual and as an organization. These things work both at the individual level and the organizational level. And then the final move is building a reliable brand. Again, as an individual, as a professional, and as an organization, right? Brand matters. And it boils down to, establishing unshakable commitment to the employee's full life cycle, helping them to understand that as an organization, you will engage in humane leadership practices, such as, being flexible about what's going on in their life, and ensuring that the work is supporting them as much as they are supporting the work. So, I think for the first year, the 5-year, the 15-year employee, these things all apply and are important.
I liked the what spoke to me about the book is it's an invitation to continuing discernment. And that's really, really important for anyone. And I loved how you brought in the examples. I want to talk about you. You're at Meta. You're an IP lawyer. You know technology. You know how to read and write and submit patents. You mentioned in the book you're a gamer. I want to talk a bit about technology and its impact on the ethical imperative. If we had to, and I know you thread this in part throughout the book, talk a little bit about technology and how the conscientious leader ought to be thinking about technology.
Technology, it's going to be with us, right? No matter, we can't run from it. As a technologist, I'm very pro technology. So I believe it has ways to help us. The most important thing we can do, though, is ensure that we are mindful of the drawbacks that technology can have. There's a great study. I didn't include it in the book, but there's a great study just about how AI as a system can be used to help judges in making bail decisions better. And the study found that after reviewing bail decisions and allowing machine learning to make decisions on bail, that the machine was able to reduce the incidences of repeat offenses with domestic violence and to make better decisions about individuals who would show up for proceedings over just humans sitting in a room looking and listening to an offender's or an alleged offender's record. So there are ways in which we can use technology to influence better outcomes in systems that we know have biases. So it helps to de-bias. And we know that in our justice system, there are some biases. We know that in our education systems, there are biases. There's a great study about how MR, which AR and VR, but mixed reality. So AR is your artificial or your augmented reality, and VR is your virtual reality. MR kind of refers to both. But in the MR context, students that were allowed to use devices that helped them have an immersive experience. The experience they used was an under the sea scuba diving experience. They found that students retained more information when they were and asked better questions as well about the flora and fauna under the water than when they were just sitting in a class listening to a lecture about it or seeing something in a TV on a screen. So there's great examples of how we can lean in to technology. With that said, one of the core themes of my book is that any process, any thought, any experience or emotion that can manifest at an individual level, it may manifest at an organizational level, given the right conditions. So this means companies, they can perpetuate acts that are hateful and loving, experience life and death, demonstrate vindictiveness as well as generosity, be innovative and stagnant. So all of this duality that exists in the human experience also exists at the organizational experience. And organizations, when they produce technology, those experiences filter into the technology. And so we have a real responsibility as leaders to adapt and be mindful of that our products and services have to be tempered with a level of conscientiousness and thoughtfulness in their deployment.
And I'm sure you're thinking a lot about that at Meta. My last question for you is one that I love to ask our authors. What are you reading and thinking about? You connect a lot of dots, a lot of stories, a lot of authors, a lot of studies in your book. What are you reading or thinking about or watching these days, Andy?
Yeah, so I just finished the book In the Garden of the Beasts. It's a book about Ambassador Dowd, who was in Nazi Germany before the fascist government took over. And it's a series of diplomatic cables and journal entries about the human experience. And it's fascinating because it helps us to understand the world in nuance and context. So I've been thinking about nuance and context a lot. Oftentimes we see things on the news and or hear things in society and we think it's black or white. And oftentimes there's this gray area, and it's hard to sift through moral principles when you have so many things coming at you, right? And listening to the French diplomats and English diplomats all trying to process different data signals in that environment, it's just a fascinating read. And I'm going to turn to Timothy Keller's book, Every Good Endeavor, next week. So that's what I'm thinking about.
I guess there's going to be another book. We'll be talking again soon. Andrew C.M. Cooper, thank you so much for joining us. The book is The Ethical Imperative: Leading with Conscience to Shape the Future of Business. Thanks for joining us at Authors and Innovators.
Thank you for having me.